Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at the story of Hosea and his wife Gomer. We have a video excerpt that explores this whole thing, and it's a fascinating story. I think you'll be surprised by how much it still applies to our lives even today.
Yeah, it's definitely a story that will get your attention.
It really does. And right away, you run into this really unusual command from God. He tells Hosea to marry a prostitute. I mean, why would God ask this of anyone? And what can we possibly learn from this strange situation?
Well, one of the interesting things is that Hosea lived in a time of peace and prosperity for Israel. But we often see this happen, right? Wealth and success, they don't always lead people to be more moral.
Yeah.
In fact, it was during this time that the Israelites started to drift away from God. They started worshiping all sorts of idols.
Yeah. It's interesting because that's something we can definitely relate to even today, right? Sometimes when things are going well in our lives, it's easy to forget about what really matters. We start chasing after all these other things, money, status, pleasure, and then all of a sudden we've completely lost our way.
Exactly. And that's what was happening with Israel. They were worshiping Baal and building golden calves, all kinds of stuff. They were breaking their covenant with God, and they were really just living for themselves. And God saw this, turning away from him as a kind of spiritual adultery. And this is where the whole story of Hosea's marriage to Gomer really comes into play. It was supposed to be this living parable, this powerful illustration of Israel's unfaithfulness.
So it's like God is saying, you want to see what it feels like to be betrayed, to have your love rejected. Okay, I want you to experience it yourself firsthand.
Exactly. It's a really profound challenge to Hosea. It makes you think about the lengths to which God is willing to go just to get our attention.
And we can't forget, Gomer wasn't just some random woman. She was a practicing prostitute. It makes his mission even more challenging.
Absolutely. And to make things even more interesting, God gave Hosea very specific instructions for the names that he should give to his children. And each one of these names was supposed to carry a prophetic message about the fate of Israel.
I've always been fascinated by that idea, God using names as prophetic tools. It's all over the Bible, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And it shows how powerful words can be. They can convey a lot of deep meaning. In Hosea's case, his children were named Jezreel, Lo-Ruhamah, and Lo-Ami.
Okay, so let's break those down a little bit. What's the significance of those names?
All right, so Jezreel, that was the name of their firstborn son, and it means God will scatter. So this name foreshadowed the scattering of Israel, the consequences of them disobeying God.
Wow, yeah. Heavy stuff. It's like each child was this living, breathing prophecy.
That's a good way to put it. And then there's the daughter, Lo-Ruhamah. Her name means no mercy. And this signified that God was withdrawing his mercy from the Israelites because they continued to rebel against him.
So the names are getting progressively more bleak, I guess you could say, reflecting the growing severity of their sin.
Yeah. And then finally another son was born, and he was named Lo-Ami. And that means not my people. This was basically God declaring that he was disowning his chosen people because they just would not stop being unfaithful to him.
Was it common for God to use names this way, or was this unique to the story of Hosea?
Well, prophetic naming does show up a few different times in the Bible. Like you have Isaiah's son, Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, and that meant the spoil speeds, the prey hastens. That was a prediction that the Assyrians were going to invade. So it is unusual, but it fits this pattern we see in the Bible of God using names to send messages and make his purposes known.
It's like this divine foreshadowing, right?
No.
Weaving prophecy into the fabric of their lives.
Exactly. And when you think about Hosea's kids, their names would have been a constant reminder to the Israelites about what would happen to them if they kept sinning. Makes you wonder what Gomer was thinking, knowing her children's names had such big implications.
Yeah, that's a great point. She's in this really tough spot. She's married to a prophet who's acting out this metaphor for God's relationship with Israel. And then on top of that, she's got kids whose names are basically judgments against her people. It's almost too much to handle, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a lot to deal with. And as you might expect, this whole situation, it takes a toll on Gomer.
So let's talk about Gomer leaving Hosea. Why did she end up leaving him?
Well, despite having all these blessings in her life, Gomer gets drawn to all the material things the world offers. She starts to believe that her lovers are the ones taking care of her. She doesn't realize that her true sustenance was coming from God through Hosea.
It's like she's blinded by this illusion of happiness. Right? She thinks that these temporary pleasures are the real deal. But deep down, don't you think there's got to be this longing for something more? I mean, what do you think was going on in her head?
That's a great question. It's hard to say for sure, but we can definitely speculate. Maybe she felt empty inside, like there was this void that couldn't be filled by stuff or relationships that didn't last. Maybe she felt trapped in all this prophetic drama and just wanted a simpler life.
Yeah, I think we can all relate to that feeling of wanting something more, that sense that there's got to be more to life than what we're experiencing. And sometimes we look for it in the wrong places.
Yeah. It's a pretty universal human experience, this wanting to find fulfillment. And even though Gomer's story happened a long time ago and in a different context, it speaks to those same desires and struggles that we have today. It reminds us that even when we have everything we think we need, there's often this deeper longing, the spiritual hunger that can only be satisfied by something way more profound.
So Gomer leaves Hosea to chase after all these temporary pleasures, thinking they'll make her happy. But what happens next? Does she find what she's looking for?
Well, that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. Gomer's life takes some unexpected turns after this, and the things she goes through after leaving Hosea reveal some pretty deep truths about sin, the consequences of the choices we make, and the power of God's love. Last time we were talking about how Gomer walked away from Hosea looking for fulfillment and all the temporary things the world has to offer.
Yeah, it's something we see over and over again, right? We convince ourselves we can find happiness in all the external stuff like possessions and status and relationships, but then we usually just end up feeling even more empty inside.
Right, and that's exactly what happens to Gomer. She goes back to being a prostitute, and she thinks this is going to give her freedom and independence. But as the story goes on, we see that she actually ends up spiraling into this deep despair.
So it's not the happy ending she thought it would be.
No, not really. The text is pretty clear about showing the hard realities of what happens because of Gomer's choices. It's a reminder that what we do has consequences. And sometimes those consequences lead us down a path we never wanted to go down in the first place.
Yeah. It makes you think about what she was going through during all those years away from Hosea. Did she regret leaving? Did she ever think about the life she left behind?
That's a really good question. I think there's a lot to unpack there. You can imagine all the emotional turmoil she must have been feeling, this internal struggle between being attracted to the world and wanting something deeper and more meaningful. It's a very human story, full of all these contradictions.
Yeah, it reminds us that even when we make bad choices, choices that lead us away from what's good and true, there's still that little bit of longing inside of us, that tiny whisper of hope that things can be different.
Exactly. And that's what makes this story so powerful, It doesn't shy away from the darkness, but it always leaves room for a glimmer of light. Even when Gomer is at her lowest point, there's this feeling that she can still be redeemed.
And that redemption comes in a pretty surprising way, doesn't it?
It does. Right when it seems like Gomer has gone too far, God tells Hosea to do something incredible. He tells him to buy Gomer back and take her as his wife again.
Hold on. So after everything she's done, God is telling Hosea to just forgive her and move on? That seems almost too good to be true.
Well, we have to remember that this whole act of buying Gomer back wasn't just about fixing their marriage. It was a symbol of God's desire to redeem his people. Remember, Israel had turned away from God and started worshiping idols. God saw this as a form of slavery.
So Hosea taking Gomer back is like a picture of God reaching down and rescuing his people from their sin, offering them a way back to himself.
Exactly. It's such a beautiful image of grace and redemption, a real demonstration of God's love and faithfulness. They never waver.
I noticed that the text says Hosea paid a certain amount to buy Gomer back, 15 shekels of silver and some barley. Was there any significance to that amount?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It wasn't just a random number. 15 shekels of silver was what you would pay for a slave back then. So it's like Hosea was buying Gomer back from being a slave, just like God redeemed his people from their spiritual slavery.
It's crazy how every little detail in the story have the deeper meaning and points to something bigger. It's like this tapestry woven with threads of love and betrayal and redemption and ultimately hope.
And what's really interesting is that even though Gomer is allowed to come back, things aren't the same as before. Hosea gives her a condition for coming back.
Oh, really? What was it?
He tells her that she has to live with him for a while, but she can't be a prostitute or have relationships with other men. It's a period of waiting and separation, a time for Gomer to think about what she's done and what happened because of her actions.
So it's like a time for her to purify herself, a chance to look inside and see that what she was chasing after was empty and rediscover her true worth.
Exactly. It wasn't about punishing her or making her feel shame. It was about making space for real repentance and restoration.
And this time of waiting that Gomer went through, do you think it also parallels the exile that Israel went through later on?
You're totally right. It foreshadows how God's people would face the consequences of being unfaithful to God, a period of being separated from God and longing for Him, which ultimately brought them back to Him.
It reminds us that sometimes, even when we wander away, God uses those difficult times to bring us back to him.
Yeah. And for both Gomer and Israel, those periods of waiting have a really important purpose. They purify us and they refine our desires. They get us ready for a deeper and more real relationship with God who loves us most.
But let's be honest. It's one thing to understand what the story symbolizes, but it's a lot harder to put it into practice in our own lives. How can we forgive people who have really hurt us, like Hosea did? It's a tough thing to do.
Yeah, it's hard, and it's something a lot of people struggle with. Our natural instinct is to hold on to the hurt we feel, to want justice and revenge. But Hosea's story shows us a different way. It's a path of forgiveness that goes against what we normally feel.
And it's not just any forgiveness, right? We're talking about forgiving someone who has broken your trust over and over again, someone who has left you to be with other people. That's a betrayal that really hurts.
It really does, and that makes Hosea's reaction even more amazing. Back in those days, in the Old Testament law, adultery was punishable by death. But Hosea and God both choose a totally different path, one of mercy and grace that leads to reconciliation.
So they're basically saying, we're not going to follow the rules. We're going to offer a radical kind of forgiveness, one that comes from love and compassion instead of wanting to punish someone.
That's a great way to put it. And it makes us think, right, how can we show that same kind of grace to people who have wronged us? It doesn't mean we are saying what they did was okay. It's about choosing to let go of the bitterness and anger that can poison us.
It's about giving up the desire to get revenge and choosing to love even when it's really, really hard. And I think we need to remember that forgiveness isn't something that happens just once. It's a process. It can take a long time, and it's tough. It means giving up control over and over and being willing to work through all the pain and hurt that was caused.
That's so important. Forgiveness doesn't usually come easily or quickly. It's a journey. You go back and forth between wanting to hold on to the anger and choosing to let go. And sometimes you need to ask for help from people who have been through it themselves.
You know, it just hit me that this whole idea of forgiveness isn't just about forgiving other people. It's also about forgiving ourselves. We can be our own worst critics, can't we? We hold on to all the guilt and shame from the things we've done wrong.
Yeah. We're often way more gracious with other people than we are with ourselves. But God offers forgiveness to those who come back to him. We can offer that same forgiveness to ourselves. It lets us move forward with freedom.
So this story of Hosea and Gomer isn't just some ancient story from the Bible. It's like a mirror reflecting all our struggles and our deepest desires. It shows us the potential we all have to change.
That's right. And when we look more closely at the final part of their story, we'll see how it still speaks to our lives today. It gives us real insight into love and forgiveness and the amazing power of grace.
Okay, so we've been looking at this amazing story of Hosea and Gomer, and wow, it's been quite a journey. We've seen betrayal and separation, and then this amazing act of redemption. But where does it all end up? What's the main point of all this?
You know, it's really interesting that even though Hosea's message about repentance was pretty much ignored by the Israelites, the book ends on this hopeful note. Even though they were unfaithful, God doesn't give up on his people.
That's hard to imagine. They're so obsessed with worshiping idols and just doing whatever they want, but God still promises to restore them.
Yeah, he does. God's love and his faithfulness are always there, no matter what. And that promise isn't just for Israel way back then. It applies to everyone who turns back to God. It doesn't matter how far they've gone.
So it's this beacon of hope in the middle of all this darkness.
Yeah.
It's there to remind us that even when we really mess things up, we can always come back to God's love.
Exactly. No matter what consequences we face because of our choices, there's always a chance for redemption, a chance to get back to that right relationship with God.
Does the book of Hosea say anything specific about what this restoration will look like? Like, how does it actually happen?
Yeah, there's this beautiful part in Hosea where God is talking to Israel and he says, I will betroth you to me forever. Yes, I will betroth you to me in righteousness and justice, in steadfast love and mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord and respond with fidelity.
Wow, that's powerful stuff. It's like a picture of this brand new covenant, a relationship based on love and faithfulness and really knowing God.
Yeah, and it's not just about something that's going to happen way off in the future. This promise is about us experiencing God's love and his faithfulness in our lives today, even when we're struggling and we mess up.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm thinking, what does this mean for us today? How can we take what we've learned from Hosea and Gomer and apply it to our own lives?
It's a really important question. First of all, it reminds us how deep God's love for us is. There's literally nothing we can do. It doesn't matter how far we stray, his love is always there, waiting for us to come back.
It's kind of like that story of the prodigal son, right? Even when we run away, our Father is there with open arms, ready to welcome us back. But it's not just about getting forgiveness from God. This story also makes us think about how we forgive other people.
Right. If God can forgive a whole nation for turning away from him, and Hosea can forgive Gomer for what she did, that's pretty intense. What does that say about how willing we are to show grace to others?
That's a tough one to think about. It makes me wonder if I'm holding on to bitterness or resentment towards someone, and that's keeping me from forgiving. It's not easy, but I think it's really important if we want to experience all of God's love and healing in our lives.
And it's not just about forgiving others, we need to forgive ourselves too. We carry so much guilt and shame for the mistakes we've made, but God's grace is bigger than any of that.
It's a process, right? Letting go of all those thoughts that tell us we're not good enough and accepting that God has forgiven us.
It is, but it's so worth it. Because when we experience the freedom of forgiveness, we discover who we really are, the people God created us to be.
So Hosea and Gomer's story isn't just some ancient story from the Bible that doesn't matter anymore. It's a message of hope and redemption and the power of love and forgiveness that never goes out of style.
It pushes us to look at our own hearts, our relationships, and how we're living with God. It reminds us that even when things are broken, there's always a chance for healing and for things to be made whole again.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive, and I really appreciate you joining us on this journey. Before we go, I want to leave you with one last thought. If God can forgive a whole nation for turning away from him, and if Hosea can forgive his wife for betraying him like that, what's possible for you? Where do you need to offer or receive forgiveness in your own life?
That's a good question to think about, because when we forgive others, we don't just set them free, we set ourselves free too.
Thanks again for being here. Until next time, keep diving deep.